She didn't scream for help. She just knelt down in the smoke, and fire pressed her hands together and whispered the only prayer she had left, because she believed no one was coming. Her own stepmother had already run out the door and left her to burn. If that story breaks your heart, stay with us. Because what happened next changed everything. A stranger on horseback saw the flames and rode straight into the fire without hesitating for even 1 second. Subscribe so you never miss a story that reminds you, even in your darkest moment, someone is coming. The night it all fell apart began the way most terrible nights do, quietly and without warning. Josephine Parker was washing the last of the supper dishes when she smelled it. Not smoke at first, something sweeter, something wrong. She set the tin cup down on the wooden counter and turned toward the hallway. The oil lamp near the far wall flickered once, twice, and then the shadows at the edge of the kitchen began to glow orange. She told herself it was nothing, a trick of the light, maybe the stove. Then the wall cracked. Not a creak, not a groan. A sharp, violent crack, like a tree splitting in a storm. And in the space where the wall boards separated, she saw it, a thin ribbon of fire eating its way through the dry wood from the outside, in moving fast and hungry and without mercy. Mama Ruth. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. Josephine cleared her throat and tried again, louder this time, moving toward the hallway. Mama Ruth, there's a fire the wall near the kitchen. Mama Ruth, wake up. Silence. She ran. Not walking fast, not stepping carefully. She ran her bare feet, slapping against the floorboards. Her nightgown catching on the corner of the chair she'd repaired 3 times with twine, because nobody ever bought anything new in this house. She reached the master bedroom door and pounded on it with both fists. There's a fire. The kitchen wall, we have to get out. The door swung open so suddenly she nearly fell forward. Ruth Calloway stood in the doorway, fully dressed, her boots already on her coat, already buttoned, and a leather travel bag clutched tight in her right hand. Josephine blinked. Something cold and instinctive moved through her body before her mind could even name it. You were already... Move. Ruth pushed past her into the hallway. Get out of my way. The back door, Josephine said, turning to follow her. The back door is closest we can... I know where the door is. Ruth didn't look back. Josephine followed her down the hallway, coughing now as the smoke began rolling in from the kitchen. The fire was spreading faster than it had any right to. The old wood of this house, dry as kindling after a summer with almost no rain, was feeding it like paper fed a candle flame. They reached the back entryway together. The small mudroom where the boots and coats were kept, where the garden tools leaned against the wall, where Josephine had spent 1,000 quiet mornings before anyone else was awake. Ruth reached the door first. She opened it. The cold night air rushed in, and Ruth Calloway walked through that door and pulled it shut behind her. Bang. Josephine stood on the other side of a closed door. For 2 full seconds, she didn't understand what had happened. She reached for the handle and turned it. The door didn't move. She rattled it once, twice, and it didn't give, because it latched from the outside with a hook-and-eye latch that Ruth had installed 2 springs ago, and that Josephine had never once needed to think about until this moment. Mama Ruth. Her voice was flat, perfectly flat, because her mind still had not accepted what her body already knew. Mama Ruth, the door, the latch. Nothing. The smoke was thickening now. Josephine could feel it pressing into her lungs with every breath, and the orange glow from the kitchen end of the house was brightening, spreading the fire, finding new paths through the walls and ceiling above her. She threw herself against the door. It didn't give. She grabbed one of the garden hose leaning against the wall and swung it at the door handle, and the frame splintered. But the door held, and the smoke was getting darker and lower, and she dropped to her knees instinctively, because she remembered someone telling her once, her father, maybe years ago, a lifetime ago, that the air was cleaner near the floor. Her father. His face came to her so clearly then that it stopped her cold for 1/2 second. William Parker, with his big rough hands and his easy laugh, and the way he'd called her Josie Bird since before she could remember, gone 6 years now, gone along with her mother in that wagon accident on the Ridgeline Road, and what had been left of Josephine's world had been handed over to his second wife, a woman she'd barely known, a woman who'd looked at a 13-year-old girl and seen nothing but inconvenience. She had no time for her father's face right now. She got back to her feet, covered her nose and mouth with the sleeve of her nightgown, and looked around the mudroom for another way out. The single window above the storage shelf. Small. Too small, maybe. But there. She climbed up onto the shelf, knocked over 3 seasons of canning jars, heard them shatter below her, and pressed her hands against the window frame. It was painted shut. Of course it was. Everything in this house had been neglected and painted over and ignored because Ruth Calloway spent money on herself and allowed the rest to rot. Josephine hit it with her palm. Then her fist. The wood held. She picked up a mason jar that hadn't broken, turned her face away, and swung it hard at the lower pane. The glass gave. Cold air hit her face. She knocked the remaining shards out with the jar's base, wrapped her nightgown sleeve around her hand, and began pulling herself through the opening, just as the ceiling at the kitchen end of the mudroom gave a long, agonized moan, and the fire broke through into the space behind her with a rush of heat that felt like standing with your back to a furnace door that had just been opened. She got her shoulders through. Then her hips caught. She twisted, pushed, felt the broken glass she'd missed, rake across her left forearm, pushed again, and fell out the other side into the dirt, landing hard on her hands and knees in the dark. She lay there for a moment she couldn't measure. The ground was cold, and the grass was damp, and somewhere above her, the farmhouse she'd spent 6 years of her life trapped inside was consuming itself in orange and black, and the sound of it was enormous, a roaring, snapping, collapsing sound that she would hear in her dreams for years to come. She pressed her cheek against the cold dirt and tried to breathe. And when she looked up, still on her hands and knees, she saw Ruth Calloway, standing 20 yards away, watching the house burn. She was not panicked. She was not running for help. She was not screaming for the neighbors or looking back toward the window where Josephine had just come through. She was standing with her travel bag in her hand, watching with an expression on her face that Josephine would spend years trying to find the right word for. Josephine pushed herself upright. "You knew." Her voice came out strange and rough with smoke. "You latched the door. You were dressed, your bag was packed. You knew." Ruth turned to look at her. She didn't flinch. She didn't look relieved. She didn't run to her and pull her into an embrace the way a mother, even a stepmother, should do when a child she believed was trapped in a burning building turns out to be alive. She just looked at her, steadily, with those flat, pale eyes that had never once held warmth. "I thought you got out. You latched the door behind you." "I must have done it without thinking. It's habit." "You were dressed. Your bag." "I've been anxious lately. I sleep dressed sometimes." Ruth's voice was perfectly smooth. "You know how I get." Josephine stared at her. She had spent 6 years in this woman's house. 6 years of watching Ruth Calloway manipulate every person who came within arm's reach. The reverend, the neighbors, the merchants in town, who all thought she was a sharp-dealing but honest woman. 6 years of watching her construct a version of herself for the world that had nothing to do with what she was behind closed doors. Ruth was lying. She had lied before. She would lie again. And there was not a single person within 10 miles who would take Josephine Parker's word over Ruth Calloway's. "You should sit down," Ruth said, her voice shifting now into something that sounded almost concerned if you didn't know better. "You've had a bad shock. You look pale." "Don't." Josephine stepped back from her. "Josephine, don't." Her voice was shaking, not with fear, with something she had no name for yet. "Don't talk to me. Don't come near me." She wrapped her arms around herself and turned away from Ruth and turned away from the burning house and stood in the dark of the field beyond the yard, and she prayed. Not the way she'd prayed inside, pressed to the floor with smoke filling her lungs. This was different. This was quieter, colder, older. "Help me, please. I don't know who's listening anymore, but if anyone is, help me. Because I can't do this alone, and I have no one left." She didn't hear the horse until it was close. The sound of hoofbeats on the county road beyond the fence line was something she'd grown up with, lived beside her whole life, and it had become the kind of sound that could pass right through you without registering. But something in her body straightened when she heard them, and she turned toward the road before her mind told her to. The rider was coming fast, not the cautious trot of someone passing by, not the curiosity-slowed walk of a neighbor coming to watch. Fast, deliberate. The horse, big, dark, strong-chested, pulled up near the fence, and the rider swung down before it had fully stopped moving, with the kind of unhurried certainty that people who have done hard physical things all their lives carry in their bodies like a second skeleton. How was tall? That was the first thing she registered. Tall and broad across the shoulders, with a hat that had been through weather and work both. And when he came over the fence in one practiced motion and crossed the yard toward the house, she realized he was heading directly toward the door. "Wait!" She found her voice. "Wait! There's no one, the house is empty." He stopped and turned. He hadn't noticed her standing in the field. In the light of the burning house, she could see his face clearly enough. Late 30s maybe, hard-worked face. A scar at the edge of his jaw that had probably come from something honest like a fence wire or a fall. He looked at her with the kind of direct attention that people who spend most of their time alone often have complete, uncomplicated, no performance in it. "Are you hurt?" Such a simple question. 4 words. She couldn't remember the last time someone had asked it with that tone in their voice. Not as a greeting, not as obligation, but as if the answer genuinely mattered, and he was prepared to do something about it. "I'm..." She looked down at her arm, where the glass had opened a cut across her forearm. Blood had run down to her wrist and dried there. She hadn't noticed it hurting until he named the possibility. "I got out through the window. Anyone else inside?" "No." She looked toward Ruth, who had moved toward the road. "No. She got out before me." He followed her gaze. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes did a small shift, like a man recalibrating information he'd already received and finding that it didn't add up. "You sure you're not hurt anywhere else?" "I'm sure." "You're standing in the cold in a nightgown with your feet bare." She looked down at her feet. She had forgotten about her feet. The ground was cold enough that she'd gone numb below the ankles and hadn't registered it. "I'm all right." He looked at her for a beat that lasted just long enough to communicate that he didn't fully believe her but wasn't going to push. Then he pulled off the heavy wool jacket he was wearing over his flannel shirt and held it out. She stared at it. "Take it." Not a command, not impatience, just the same simple directness. "I've got a flannel on underneath. I don't get cold easy." She took the jacket. She didn't know why she had survived 6 years in that house by being careful about accepting things from people, because everything always came with conditions attached. But she took it and put it around her shoulders, and it was warm from his body, and smelled like horses, and wood smoke, and clean air. "Henry Sullivan." He extended his right hand. "I run the Sullivan Ranch about 4 miles west on Ridgeline." She looked at his hand. Then she shook it. "Josephine Parker." "Miss Parker." He turned toward the fire again, watching it with the same calm attention he'd been giving her. "The county fire crew'll be out by morning, but there won't be much left to see. That wood went up fast." It was dry. Her voice came out flat again. Everything here was dry. He glanced at her sideways. She thought he might ask more. He didn't. "There's somewhere you can go tonight, family, neighbors." She almost laughed. "No. Friends in town." She thought of the women her age in Millhaven, who had mostly married and built their lives, and who had stopped inviting her anywhere years ago because she was always busy, or Ruth wouldn't let her leave. "No." Henry Sullivan was quiet for a moment. He turned and looked toward the road where Ruth was standing, still standing, travel bag in hand, watching the house with those flat, pale eyes. "That your stepmother?" "Yes." "She live in town?" "She has a sister in Granville, I think, 2 hours east." Josephine pulled his jacket tighter around herself. "She'll go there." "And you?" "I don't know." He turned back to the fire. She could see him working something through in his mind, not reluctantly, not with visible calculation. More like a man who has made a certain kind of decision 100 times and knows the shape of it. "My ranch has a guest room," Henry Sullivan said. It's plain and it's small and it's got a drafty window I haven't gotten around to fixing yet. But it's warm and it's dry and the bed's got a real mattress." He looked at her directly. "You're welcome to it. No conditions, no obligation. Just a roof until you figure out what's next." She studied him. She had spent 6 years studying people for the thing underneath what they were presenting. The angle, the price tag, the favor that would be called in. She looked for it in Henry Sullivan's face and found nothing but straightforwardness, and that somehow was the most disorienting thing of all. "Why?" He seemed to consider whether the question deserved a long answer or a short one. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said finally. "And because I can." She didn't say yes right away. She stood there in his jacket with the fire behind her and her stepmother on the road, and the cold coming up through the soles of her bare feet, and she felt something happening in her chest that she couldn't quite name. Not trust, not yet, but the precursor to it. The careful, cautious cracking open of a door she'd kept bolted shut for a very long time. "I'll need to find shoes," she said. He nodded, as if she'd accepted a simple invitation to dinner. "I've got a spare pair of riding boots in the saddlebag. They'll be too big, but they'll keep the cold off." He turned toward his horse. "My offer's open as long as you need it, Miss Parker. No one should be standing in a field in their nightgown trying to figure out where their life goes from here." She followed him toward the horse. Behind her, the farmhouse that had held her hostage for 6 years finished collapsing into itself with a long, final sound like something exhaling. She didn't look back. They passed Ruth on the way to the road. Ruth didn't call out to her, didn't reach for her arm, or say her name. She simply watched with those flat, pale eyes as Josephine walked past her in Henry Sullivan's jacket with his spare riding boots on her feet. And when Josephine met her gaze for one brief moment, she saw something in Ruth's expression that clarified everything she'd been trying to name since she'd found herself standing on the other side of a latched door in a burning house. Calculation. Not guilt. Not shame. Just calculation. The rapid, practiced arithmetic of a woman figuring out whether this new development served her or threatened her. Josephine broke eye contact and kept walking. Henry was already at the fence. He held the wire apart without being asked so she could step through, and then he mounted his horse and held a hand down to help her up. She hesitated, not because she was afraid. Because she was aware with sudden and complete clarity that this was one of those hinge moments in a life. The kind you can feel even when you're inside them. The kind that close one door and open another so completely that the person you were on the other side becomes someone you have to work to remember. She took his hand. He pulled her up behind him in one easy motion. "You'll need to hold on," he said. "Ridley moves fast on a cold night." She put her hands on either side of his jacket, not around him, not touching him, but close enough that she could feel the steadiness of him, the solidity of a person who knew where he was in the world. She had not felt that kind of solidity in 6 years, maybe longer. The horse moved into the road and turned west, and the glow of the burning farmhouse shrank behind them, and Josephine Parker rode away from the only life she had known into a darkness that was for the first time in as long as she could remember, full of something other than dread. She didn't sleep in the guest room that first night. Not because it wasn't comfortable. It was more comfortable than anything she'd slept on in years. A real mattress with a real quilt and a pillow that hadn't gone flat. But she sat up in the chair beside the drafty window Henry had mentioned and watched the dark outside and turned everything over in her mind, the way you do when something happens that's too large to simply absorb. Her stepmother had latched that door. That was the fact she kept returning to. Everything else, the fire, the escape through the window, the cut on her arm that Henry's housekeeper, a quiet older woman named Mrs. Brecken, had cleaned and wrapped before she went to bed. All of it was secondary to that one fact. Ruth Calloway had walked out of a burning house and latched the door behind her, and a 19-year-old girl on the other side of that door was supposed to have died. Was supposed to have. Josephine pressed her fingers against the windowsill and felt the cold air coming through the gap. Henry hadn't fixed yet. Why would Ruth want her dead? She turned it over. She turned it over again. Her father's property. The farmland. The acreage that he'd owned outright before he died, that had gone to Ruth as his wife, that Ruth controlled now, but that Josephine would inherit some portion of when she turned 21. She was 25 now. Wait. She sat up straighter in the chair. She was 25 years old. She had been 25 for 3 months, and she had not. She pressed her hand to her mouth. She had not thought about the inheritance clause in her father's will in so long that she had simply forgotten it. She had been 19 when her father died, lost in grief, when the family lawyer in Millhaven had explained that Ruth would hold the estate in trust until Josephine reached the age of 21, at which point Josephine would receive her portion. But Josephine had never received anything. She had never gone to the lawyer. She had never gone anywhere. Ruth controlled everything: who she saw, where she went, what she knew, and Josephine, worn down and isolated, and convinced she had no options, had simply never pressed the point. She sat in the drafty chair in Henry Sullivan's guest room in the dark, and understood, perhaps for the first time with complete clarity, that she had not been kept out of ignorance. She had been kept on purpose. The morning came in gray and quiet, and with it, Mrs. Brecken. She appeared at the guest room door with coffee and a plate of eggs and biscuits, and the matter-of-fact warmth of a woman who had learned long ago that the best thing you could do for someone who'd had a bad night was feed them without asking them to talk about it first. Mr. Sullivan said to let you sleep as long as you needed. She set the plate on the small table near the window and looked at the chair Josephine was sitting in with clear-eyed recognition. You didn't sleep. No. The coffee's hot. Eggs are fresh. Mrs. Brecken paused at the door. He's out in the barn if you want to talk to him. He'll be there most of the morning. She left without asking anything else. Josephine ate the eggs and drank the coffee and looked out the window at the ranch yard in the gray morning light. She could see the outlines of the barn and the fencing and the shape of the land beyond, flat and wide, and going all the way to a horizon that she could actually see for the first time in years because there were no walls around her. She put on the clothes Mrs. Brecken had left folded on the foot of the bed. Practical things, a little too large, but clean and warm, and walked across the yard to the barn. Henry was mending a length of fence wire when she came in, working with the focused efficiency of a man who didn't mind repetitive physical work because it left his mind free. He looked up when she entered and nodded, which she was beginning to understand was his version of a full greeting. I need to go into town, she said, to see a lawyer. He didn't ask why. He set down the wire and straightened. Fenwick and Millhaven, or Alderson. She blinked. You know the lawyers in Millhaven. I've had occasion. Alderson's sharper, Fenwick's cheaper. He looked at her steadily. Which do you need? I don't know yet. She pressed her hands together. There's something about my father's estate that I think I need to understand better than I do. He was quiet for a moment. Not the uncomfortable quiet of someone waiting for more information. The quiet of someone deciding how to offer help without overstepping. I've got business in Millhaven Thursday, he said. If you want to wait 2 days, I can take you in, or I can have Mrs. Brecken take you today if it's urgent. Thursday is fine. She exhaled. Thank you. He picked up the fence wire again. Mrs. Brecken'll need to take your measurements today if you want anything to wear in the meantime. She keeps fabric around. She makes things. He paused. She won't mind. Josephine stood in this barn doorway and looked at this man who had ridden into a burning farmhouse for a stranger who had offered his guest room without conditions, who was now matter-of-factly arranging for her to have clothes and a lawyer and 2 days of ordinary time to collect herself. And she felt that careful, cautious cracking open in her chest again, wider this time. Mr. Sullivan? He looked up. Why did you ride into the fire? She had to ask. She couldn't rest until she knew. Other people stopped and watched. You rode in. He held the fence wire in his hands and looked at it for a moment before he answered. I saw a light in the window, he said. 2nd floor. Like someone holding a lamp or a candle moving around. I figured whoever was in there hadn't gotten out. He looked at her directly. I could have been wrong. The house could have come down on me. But I figured if I was in there and there was someone outside, I'd want them to try. She absorbed that. The light was probably the fire itself, she said. Moving through the walls. Probably. He went back to the wire. Good thing I didn't know that. She stood there for another moment, and then she made a decision of her own, not large, not dramatic, just quiet and certain. "I'll stay through Thursday," she said. "And then we'll see." Henry Sullivan didn't make a big thing of it. He just nodded. "Mrs. Brecken makes good biscuits," he said. "Breakfast's at 6. She walked back across the yard to the house, and the cold air on her face felt clean, and she breathed it in, and she thought, "I'm still here. Against everything that tried to stop me. I'm still here." The fire had taken her old life. She just didn't know yet what it had given her back. Thursday arrived with frost on the ground, and a sky the clear, hard blue of October mornings, and Henry Sullivan drove the wagon to Millhaven with Josephine beside him on the bench, and neither of them feeling any particular need to fill the miles with conversation. She had spent the 2 days between learning the ranch and learning herself. Mrs. Brecken had made her a dress and a working skirt and a blouse, and she'd helped with the kitchen and the chickens, not because anyone asked, but because she needed to move, needed to be useful, needed to feel the satisfaction of a task completed in a space where the completing of it was actually appreciated, rather than expected and ignored. And Henry Sullivan, working from before dawn to after dark, as reliable as fence posts, as unhurried as weather, had treated her with the same uncomplicated respect on the second day as on the first. No conditions, no price. She was still waiting for the other shoe. In Millhaven, Henry went to his business at the feed store, and Josephine found Alderson's office on the main street, narrow, tidy, with a hand-lettered sign above the door. The lawyer was a small, compact man in his 50s with sharp eyes and the manner of someone who had heard a great many difficult stories and had made peace with the fact that the law was a blunt instrument at best. She told him who she was. She told him who her father was. She told him about the will. He was quiet for a long time after she finished. Then he got up from his desk and went to a long row of file cabinets against the wall and spent 3 minutes pulling drawers and looking through folders. And when he came back to his desk, he had a document in his hand that he set on the desk and looked at, and then looked at her with an expression that was not quite surprise, but not quite not surprise either. "Miss Parker," he said carefully, "you turned 21 4 years ago. I know. Your father's estate, the farmland, the acreage and the remaining accounts should have transferred to joint control between you and Mrs. Calloway at that time, with your portion, which is roughly 40% of the total assessed value, yours outright." Josephine kept her voice very steady. "And it didn't. The filing that came through this office 4 years ago indicated that you had signed a document relinquishing your claim in favor of Mrs. Calloway, retaining full control." He turned the paper to show her. "This is that document, with what appears to be your signature." She looked at the signature. Josephine M. Parker. Her handwriting. Her signature. Except she had never signed it. She looked up at the lawyer. He looked back at her with those sharp, patient eyes. "I never signed that document," she said. He was very still. "No," he said quietly. "I didn't think you had." The wagon ride back to the ranch was quiet, but it was a different quiet from the ride into town. Henry could tell without being told that something had shifted. He'd learned in the past 2 days that Josephine Parker did not say more than she needed to, and did not ask for things she hadn't thought through completely. And when she climbed back onto the wagon bench with a face that was controlled in the specific way of someone controlling something very large, he let her have the silence until she was ready to break it. They were 2 miles out of Millhaven when she said, "She forged my signature." He let that sit. "She kept everything my father's land, the accounts, by forging my signature on a legal document relinquishing my claim." Her voice was even. Too even. 4 years ago. Which means she's been planning this for a long time. How long? Since before my father died, possibly. She looked straight ahead at the road. "She married him when I was 12. I thought at the time she just didn't like me. I didn't understand then that she was specifically waiting for me to become old enough that I could sign something, and specifically young enough that I might not know I'd been cheated." Henry was quiet for a moment. "And the fire." She turned to look at him then. "The fire," she said, "was either to destroy evidence or to destroy me before I could find it. Or both." Her jaw tightened briefly. I was supposed to die in there, Mr. Sullivan. The door was latched from the outside. I would have died in there. Henry Sullivan held the reins with both hands and looked at the road ahead and was very still for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was the same as it always was, even direct, unhurried. But something underneath it had changed in a way she could hear if she was paying attention. "Then we need to go back to Alderson," he said, "with everything you just told me." We. She heard that word. We. She turned it over in her mind, the way she'd turned over the other facts that had assembled themselves in the past 2 days, and she found that unlike so many things she'd turned over expecting to find the angle and the price, this one stayed clean all the way through. "Yes," she said. "We do." The wagon moved west on the Ridgeline Road, and the ranch came into view on the horizon, small and real and solid, with smoke coming from the chimney. Because Mrs. Brecken kept a warm house, and Josephine Parker looked at it and felt something she hadn't felt in so long that she'd nearly forgotten its name: safe. Not because nothing bad was happening. Because she wasn't facing it alone. And that feeling, fragile as new ice over a deep river, was the most dangerous thing Josephine Parker had allowed herself to feel in 6 years, because she knew with the bone-deep certainty of someone who had been disappointed too many times that it could still be taken from her. She held on to it anyway. That night after supper, after Mrs. Brecken had cleared the table and retired to her room off the back of the house, Josephine sat across from Henry Sullivan with a cup of coffee going cold between her hands and told him everything. Not the edited version she'd given Alderson. Everything. From the first week after her father's funeral, when Ruth had moved her out of her bedroom into the small room above the kitchen, to the way food was rationed when Josephine displeased her, to the years of being told she was lucky anyone kept her at all. She told it the way you tell a thing when you've held it so long it started to feel like part of your body, carefully, with pauses, like pulling something that's grown roots. Henry listened without interrupting. When she finished, the fire in the stove had burned down to coals and the room had gone colder, and he was still sitting across from her with both hands around his own cup and his eyes on her with that complete, uncomplicated attention she still wasn't used to. "How long did you know it was bad?" His voice was quiet. "Really know?" She thought about it honestly. "Always. But knowing and having somewhere to go are two different things. You didn't have anyone." "I had no one." She corrected it without self-pity, just as fact. "My mother's people were all gone before I was born. My father's brother died in the war. There was a woman, a neighbor, Mrs. Holt, who used to look at me sometimes in church with an expression like she suspected something. But she never asked, and I never said." Henry was quiet for a moment. "People don't ask," he said, "because asking makes it real, and then they have to do something about it." She looked at him across the table. "Is that what you were thinking when you saw the fire?" "I wasn't thinking." He set his cup down. "I was riding." She understood what he meant. There are people in the world who think first, and there are people who move first, and thinking people often arrive too late, and Henry Sullivan was simply not built for thinking first when something was on fire. "Alderson wants to meet again Friday," she said, pulling herself back to the practical. "He said he needs to verify the handwriting on the signature document against other records of mine. If he can establish the forgery with enough certainty, he can file a challenge to the estate settlement. And Ruth. She doesn't know I went to see him. She doesn't know I'm here. She thinks I'm—" Josephine paused. "I don't know what she thinks. I don't know where she thinks I am." Henry looked at her steadily. "She's going to find out. I know. When she does, she'll move fast. If there's property involved, land accounts, she'll want to lock things down before any legal challenge can take hold." He turned his cup on the table, thinking. "She'll know you can't challenge her without money for lawyers and witnesses and a sympathetic judge. She'll be counting on you having none of those things." Josephine looked at him. "I have none of those things," she said plainly. Henry Sullivan met her eyes. "You have a witness to the night of the fire," he said. "You have me." The words landed quietly the way solid things do. Not a dramatic declaration, not a promise wrapped in flourish. Just a plain statement of fact from a man who meant exactly what he said and not one syllable more. She looked down at her cold coffee. "Mr. Sullivan, I can't ask you to get involved in this. Ruth Calloway has friends in this county. She's been cultivating them for years. She pressed her fingers against the rim of the cup. If she decides to come after you, your reputation, your land deals, your relationships with the merchants in Millhaven, she can make your life very difficult. I know what she can do. He stood, picked up both cups, and carried them to the wash basin. I watched my father lose everything he had to a man who did exactly that kind of quiet damage. I know what it looks like. He turned back to her from across the room. That's not a reason to stay out of it. That's a reason to move first. She stared at him. You have a plan, she said slowly. I have the beginning of one. Tell me. He came back to the table, and he sat down and he told her. And as he talked, she felt something she had not felt in so long that she was halfway through feeling it before she recognized it. Hope. Not wishful hoping. Not desperate hoping. The kind that has a shape, a real workable shape, and a set of concrete steps, and a person willing to take them with you. She was not prepared for how much it undid her. She pressed her hand flat on the table and breathed carefully through her nose until she was certain she was not going to embarrass herself. You all right? Henry noticed. Of course he noticed. He noticed everything quietly without making a production of it. Yes. She straightened. Tell me the rest. Friday came, and with it Alderson, and with Alderson came the handwriting examiner he'd brought in from the county seat, a pinched, precise man named Mr. Voss, who wore a magnifying loupe on a chain around his neck and handled documents with 2 fingers, and spoke in the clipped, authoritative tone of someone who had spent his entire career being correct about things that other people wished he were wrong about. He spent 45 minutes with the disputed signature and 3 authenticated samples from county records. Josephine's signature on a property witness document from when she was 16, a school enrollment paper from when she was 15, and a church membership record from when she was 17, and then he set down his loupe and folded his hands on Alderson's desk. The disputed signature is not hers. His tone left no room for negotiation. The letter forms are close, someone who knew her handwriting practiced this. But the pen pressure is wrong throughout, and the characteristic way she forms the capital P is inverted in the disputed document. Whoever signed this wrote it from a traced model, not from their own hand. The room was very quiet. Josephine was sitting with her hands folded in her lap, and she was thinking very clearly and very coldly, with a kind of clear-eyed anger she had never allowed herself before, because anger requires the belief that you have the right to be angry, and she had spent 6 years being told she had no rights at all. She had the right now. Can that testimony hold in court? Henry asked from his chair beside her. Voss looked at him. It has before, and will again. Alderson, who had been making notes throughout, looked up over his spectacles. The question isn't the testimony, Mr. Sullivan. The testimony will hold. The question is the judge. He set down his pen. The Calloway family, Ruth Calloway's people before she married William Parker, have had a long relationship with Judge Harmer in this district. He has ruled in their favor consistently for 20 years on matters large and small. Then we don't use Harmer, Henry said. The jurisdiction is there a mechanism for requesting a change of venue or a different judge on grounds of conflict of interest? Alderson looked at him with the expression of a man recalibrating his initial assessment of who he was dealing with. There is. It requires documented cause, and it takes time. How much time? 3 to 6 weeks to file and have the request considered. And during that 3 to 6 weeks, can Ruth Calloway liquidate the land or the accounts? She could try. With a legal challenge pending, and filed, any transaction above a certain threshold would require disclosure and could be contested. Alderson removed his spectacles and cleaned them. The filing alone creates a kind of protection, like a fence. Josephine spoke for the first time since Voss had delivered his finding. Then we file, today, as fast as it can be done. Both men looked at her. She met their eyes without flinching. I was supposed to die in that fire, she said, and her voice was calm and clear and utterly without drama. I didn't. I am not going to sit and wait while she figures out how to finish what she started. Alderson put his spectacles back on and picked up his pen. "Then let's draw up the filing," he said. She learned later, much later, that Ruth Calloway heard about the legal filing before the ink was fully dry. Small towns are small in all the ways that matter, and Millhaven was smaller than most in the ways that mattered most. And there were people in Alderson's building, a clerk, a receptionist's cousin, a man who sat in the waiting area and repaired watches and overheard things, who had connections to connections that eventually reached Ruth Calloway's ear before she'd even arrived at her sister's house in Granville. Josephine didn't know this yet. She was riding back to the ranch on the wagon bench beside Henry, and the sky was doing something extravagant with the light at the horizon, and for the first time in longer than she could measure, she felt the particular exhaustion that comes not from defeat, but from having finally fought. Voss was certain, she said. It wasn't a question. She'd heard him. She just needed to say it out loud. Very certain. Henry kept his eyes on the road. He's testified in 6 forgery cases in the district. Never been successfully challenged. Ruth is going to say I manipulated him. Or Alderson. She pulled the borrowed coat tighter. She's going to say I'm a grieving, unstable girl, making accusations against a woman who took care of her out of charity. Henry glanced sideways at her. Probably, he agreed. She's very good at that, making herself the victim. Josephine looked at her hands. She did it with my father for years. He thought she was delicate. He thought she needed protecting. He never saw... She stopped. He loved her. He loved who he thought she was. Her voice was careful, not bitter. She showed him a version of herself that was completely constructed. By the time I understood what was happening, he was already gone, and there was no one left to tell. A long silence passed, filled with the sound of hooves on the hard-packed road and the creak of the wagon. He would be angry, Henry said quietly. She looked at him. Your father, if he knew. He kept his eyes on the road. A man who builds a ranch and leaves it for his family, he'd be angry that it was used as a weapon against his daughter. That's not what he built it for. She felt the words move through her chest in a way she didn't expect. She had thought about her father's anger only in the abstract, the righteous, useless anger of the dead who can no longer intervene. She had not thought about it as something personal, something specific, something that would be on her behalf. She had spent so long being told she had no value to anyone that she had stopped imagining herself as someone worth being angry for. She turned away before he could see her face. He built it for my mother, she said, before she died. He started over after, but he always said the land remembered her. A pause. I used to believe that, when I was young. What do you believe now? She was quiet for a moment. That land doesn't remember anything, she said. But people do. Henry said nothing, just drove. But something in the set of his shoulders told her he had heard exactly what she meant. 3 days later, Ruth Calloway came to the ranch. Josephine was in the side yard with Mrs. Brecken working a length of fabric through the wringer press when she heard the wheels on the road and looked up and saw the hired buggy coming through the front gate. She knew before she could see her face who it was. The way a person moves. The set of the spine, the angle of the head, is something you learn in 6 years of close quarters, whether you want to or not. Josephine had learned Ruth Calloway the way prisoners learn the sound of their jailer's footstep. She set down her end of the fabric and straightened. Mrs. Brecken, who was a woman who had survived 62 years on this earth by paying close attention to the temperature of rooms, looked from Josephine's face to the approaching buggy and said nothing at all. She simply moved to stand beside her, which was, Josephine would think later, one of the kindest things anyone had done for her in a long time. Ruth climbed down from the buggy before the driver had fully stopped it. She was dressed impeccably. That was always the first thing, the precision of her presentation, the message that she had already calculated and was already composed while you were still reacting. She wore her good coat and her good gloves, and her expression was carefully arranged into something that from a distance might look like concern. Josephine. She came across the yard without being invited and stopped 6 feet away. I've been worried sick. I didn't know where you'd gone. Josephine looked at her. She let the silence go exactly 1 beat too long long enough for Ruth to feel the shape of it. "I went to see a lawyer," Josephine said. Ruth's expression did not flicker. "Did you?" "Alderson and Milhaven. About my father's estate." Ruth tilted her head slightly, a gesture of patient confusion that Josephine recognized as manufactured. "Sweetheart, we discussed all of that years ago. The estate was settled. You signed the paperwork yourself." "I didn't. I have the document." "I know what the document says." Josephine kept her voice level. "I know what the signature looks like, and I know it isn't mine." Now, finally, something moved in Ruth's eyes. Not guilt, not fear, something colder. The recalculation, the rapid practiced assessment of damage and response. "I think," Ruth said carefully, "that grief and trauma can do terrible things to a person's memory. You've been through so much, Josephine. The fire, the loss of the home, it would affect anyone's sense of what's real." The handwriting examiner was very clear on what's real. A beat. Handwriting examiner. Ruth repeated the words the way you repeat something to buy time. "Mr. Voss from the county seat." He compared the disputed signature to 3 authenticated samples. Josephine kept her eyes on Ruth's face. He was unambiguous. Ruth was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. Josephine counted. Then she changed tacks, and it was like watching a door in a house swing shut on one corridor and open on another, smooth and practiced and quick. "I see someone has been telling you things," Ruth said, and her eyes moved toward the house behind Josephine, toward Henry Sullivan's house, with pointed deliberateness. "Someone who may have his own reasons for wanting to come between us." "There is no us." "I raised you, Josephine. I kept you fed and housed for 6 years after your father left us both with nothing. He left me 40% of his land and his accounts." Josephine's voice did not rise. It didn't need to. "You know that. You've always known that. That's why you forged my signature. That's why you latched the door." Ruth went very still. It was the door. The mention of the door did it. Something shifted in her face, small, subtle, the micro-movement of a person who has been found out and is instantly calculating the best available lie. "I don't know what you think you saw. I know what I know." Josephine took 1 step forward. "I know what you did. The lawyer knows what you did. And there is a legal filing in this county right now that says so in writing." For the first time, Ruth Calloway looked at her. Really looked at her as if she were seeing not the frightened girl she'd spent 6 years managing, but someone else entirely. Someone she hadn't accounted for. Good, Josephine thought. Good. "See me. You'll regret this." Ruth's voice had dropped to something quieter and more dangerous than her public voice. "You have no money, no family, no standing. You're living on the charity of a man you've known for less than 2 weeks. Judge Harmer has known my family for 20 years. We've requested a different judge." Ruth blinked. It was the first unguarded thing she did, that single blink of genuine surprise, and it was worth more to Josephine than everything else that had happened in the yard that morning. She had surprised her. She had outmaneuvered her. She who had nothing, who was supposed to be dead, who was supposed to be ash in the rubble of a burned farmhouse on a county road, had already moved 2 steps ahead. "You should go," Josephine said quietly. "There's nothing here for you, Mama Ruth." She had not called her that in years. She used it now deliberately, with full understanding of what it meant. Not warmth, not connection, but the precise naming of what Ruth had claimed to be, and what she had never not for a single day actually been. Ruth stood in the yard for a moment that was a little too long. Then she turned, walked back to the hired buggy, and climbed in without looking back. Josephine watched until the buggy cleared the front gate. Then her legs went unsteady, and she put her hand on the ringer press to hold herself up, and Mrs. Brecken said very calmly, without making a fuss, "Come inside, I'll put the kettle on." And Josephine went inside. Henry had watched the whole thing from the barn doorway. He hadn't come out. She hadn't needed him to come out. If she had needed him, she would have looked toward the barn, and he'd been watching closely enough to move the moment she did. She hadn't looked. She'd handled it. completely and entirely alone with her borrowed dress and her bare chin and 6 years of accumulated knowledge about exactly how Ruth Calloway operated. When he came in for the midday meal, he sat down across from her the way he always did and poured his own coffee and said, "She's going to move on the property." "I know." Josephine wrapped both hands around her cup. "She left too quickly. That's not her real play." He looked at her. "She needed to see how much I knew," she said. "Now she knows. She'll be calculating her next step." She looked up at him. "How fast can Alderson put a lien on the property?" Henry set his cup down. "I'll ride to Millhaven this afternoon." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." He stood and pulled on his jacket. "Tell Mrs. Brecken I won't be back for supper. There's a fence line on the north side. I meant to check tomorrow. She'll know to send Davies out there instead." He was at the door before she found the words. "Mr. Sullivan." He turned. She looked at him from across the kitchen table with the cold morning light on her face and 6 days of surviving behind her and a fight that was nowhere near over still ahead of her, and she said the thing she had never been able to say to anyone in 6 years. "Thank you." He held her gaze for a moment, just a moment. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "We haven't won anything." He went out. She listened to the sound of his horse leaving the yard at a fast trot, and she turned back to her coffee, and she thought, "No, but we're going to." The Lion was filed by end of day. Alderson sent word with his clerk just before dark, a short note factual, that confirmed the filing, and added in Alderson's careful handwriting, "Mrs. Calloway attempted to arrange a private sale of the eastern acreage this afternoon." The buyer withdrew when notified of the pending legal action. "Move quickly, she will not stop." Josephine read the note 3 times. She had tried to sell the land. Today, before the day was out. She had gone directly from the Sullivan Ranch to a land buyer in Millhaven and tried to liquidate. The coldness of it, the speed, the calculation, the complete absence of anything resembling conscience settled into Josephine's bones and sat there. She wasn't surprised. She had known for 6 years what Ruth Calloway was. She had simply not understood until this week the full scope of what she was willing to do. The fire was not impulse. The forgery was not impulse. The attempted sale today was not impulse. This was a woman who planned. And if she planned well enough and moved fast enough and found the right buyer and the right moment, she could still make Josephine's legal challenge into a years-long fight over an estate that no longer existed in its original form. Henry came back after dark with mud on his boots and the expression of a man who had spent the afternoon doing things he didn't particularly enjoy, but had done them anyway because they needed doing. She showed him the note. He read it. He set it on the table. "She knows she's losing the legal ground," he said. "So she's going to try to take what she can before the ground closes." "We need to move faster," Josephine said. "Whatever motion we can file, whatever we can do to freeze the assets completely, we need to do it now. Not next week. Now." He looked at her. "Alderson said he needs a statement from you. Formal, sworn, specific, about the night of the fire." She went still. A formal, sworn statement. Naming Ruth Calloway. Describing the latched door and the deliberate abandonment. Making a legal accusation of she understood the weight of this attempted murder. Because that was what it was. She had been circling the words for a week, calling it abandonment and deception and conspiracy. But underneath all of it, at the center of everything, was a simpler, darker, heavier word. She had been left to die, on purpose, by the person legally responsible for her care. Josephine. Henry's voice was quiet. He had the way of saying her name when he meant to bring her back to solid ground, not by force, but by steadiness. The way you'd take the arm of someone standing too close to an edge. "You don't have to do this tonight. If I don't do it tonight, she sells the land." "Maybe. But pushing yourself past what you can hold right now doesn't help the case." She looked at him. "What I can hold," she repeated slowly. "You've held a great deal this week." His voice was still completely even. "You're allowed to breathe." She sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "I'll give the statement tomorrow morning, first thing." She pushed her chair back and stood. "But I need you to come with me. Not to speak, Just to be there. He nodded as simply as if she'd asked him to pass the salt. "I'll be there," he said. She nodded. She went to bed. She didn't sleep, but she lay still, and she breathed, and she thought about her father. Not the dead version, not the gone version, but the living version, the one with the rough hands and the easy laugh. And she thought, "I'm doing this for both of us, Pa. She took from both of us, and I'm going to get it back." In the morning she gave the statement. Every word, every detail. The way Ruth was dressed, the travel bag, the sound of the latch closing, the smoke, the window, the glass, the cold ground, and the way Ruth had been standing 20 yards away, watching the house burn without calling for help, without looking for her, without doing anything except watching. Alderson wrote it all down. Voss, the handwriting man, witnessed the signing. Henry Sullivan sat in the chair beside her and did not speak and did not have to. When it was done, Alderson looked across his desk at Josephine Parker with an expression that was as close to admiration as a careful lawyer allows himself in a professional setting. "You understand," he said carefully, "that when this statement becomes part of the public record, Mrs. Calloway may take action, not legal action, other kinds." "I understand. She has friends. She has influence. So do I." Josephine held his gaze. "I have the truth, and I have a witness who rode into a burning building." She folded her hands on the desk. "Let her come." Alderson looked from her to Henry. Henry said nothing. He didn't need to. Alderson nodded slowly, gathered the papers, and began preparing the filing that would change everything. Outside the town of Millhaven went about its ordinary morning, the feed store opening, the women going to market, the children walking to school, entirely unaware that in a small lawyer's office on the main street, a 25-year-old woman who was supposed to be dead was filing the paperwork for the rest of her life. And sitting beside her, as solid and unhurried as the land he worked, was the man who had ridden into the fire without thinking, who was now learning day by careful day that the woman he had pulled from the flames was the kind of person who walked back into the fire on her own terms, and found it did not frighten her anymore. That understanding, quiet and absolute, settled into Josephine's chest like a coal that had finally stopped burning and become something harder and more permanent. She had walked into Alderson's office afraid of what saying the truth out loud would cost her. She walked out understanding that the truth had already been paid for in full. The night she crawled through a broken window with glass in her arm, while her stepmother stood 20 yards away and watched. The cost was already behind her. Everything ahead was something else. The town of Millhaven did not erupt when the filing hit the public record. It didn't do anything so dramatic. What it did was quieter, and in some ways worse, it murmured. The particular low murmur of a small town absorbing a piece of information it doesn't quite know what to do with, turning it over from person to person. Like a stone passed around a table, each person adding the weight of their own interpretation before passing it on. Josephine felt it the first time she walked into the dry goods store on a Wednesday morning 2 weeks after the filing. The conversation at the counter stopped, not all at once. It tapered off the way conversations do when the person thereabout walks through the door, and by the time she reached the counter, there was a silence that had the particular quality of something that had been talking about her. The woman behind the counter, Mrs. Gale, who had sold Ruth Calloway fabric and thread and notions for 15 years, looked at Josephine with an expression that tried to be neutral and landed somewhere just south of it. "Miss Parker." The name came out with a faint upward note. Not quite a question. "What can I get you?" Josephine put her list on the counter and held Mrs. Gale's gaze with the same steady attention she'd been practicing since the night she rode away from a burning house on a stranger's horse. "These items, please. I'll wait." Mrs. Gale looked at the list, then at Josephine, then at the two women at the far end of the counter who were not quite looking anywhere. "I heard about your trouble," Mrs. Gale said in the careful tone of a woman choosing words with both hands. "I was sorry to hear about the fire." "Thank you. Mrs. Calloway has been a customer of mine for many years." "I know she has." A beat. The two women at the far end shifted. "She's been saying," Mrs. Gale started, then seemed to reconsider. "Well, people are saying different things. People generally do. Josephine kept her voice completely pleasant. I know what I saw the night of the fire. I know what Mr. Voss found about the signature. The court will sort out the rest. She looked at the list. The flower and the thread whenever you're ready, Mrs. Gale. Mrs. Gale filled the order. She was not warm, but she was not obstructive, and Josephine took that as the small pragmatic victory it was, and walked out with her supplies. Outside, she stood for a moment in the cold air and breathed. Ruth had been talking. Of course she had. Ruth was never more dangerous than when she was losing, because losing made her talk faster and plan harder and move through the community like water finding every crack and gap in a wall. She would have already told her version of events to every person whose opinion mattered, the Reverend the Ladies' Society, the merchants, the county commissioner's wife. She would have done it with that practiced expression of bewildered hurt, the expression of a woman who had given everything and was being repaid with accusation. Josephine knew that expression, the way she knew her own face in a mirror. What she hadn't anticipated was how much it would still sting. Not because she doubted herself, because she was human, and there is something specific and awful about being lied about in public by someone who knows exactly which lies will be believed, and knowing you cannot correct all of them, and knowing that some people will always prefer the comfortable story over the true one. She walked back to where Henry's wagon was hitched outside the feed store and put her supplies in the back. Henry came out of the feed store a few minutes later with 2 large sacks and Davies, his hired hand, behind him with 2 more. He looked at her face and didn't ask any questions while Davies loaded the wagon. But when Davies went back inside for the remaining order, Henry said quietly, "What happened?" "Nothing dramatic." She straightened the supplies in the wagon bed. "Ruth has been talking. Mrs. Gale wanted me to know she's heard both sides." Henry was quiet for a moment. "Gale's cautious," he said. "She doesn't commit to sides until she's sure which side is solid. That she mentioned it at all means she's still deciding. And the ones who've already decided against me," he looked at her directly. "There will be some. There always are. The question is whether there are enough of them to matter in a courtroom, and there won't be. What matters in that room is Voss's testimony and your sworn statement and the fire investigator's report." She turned to look at him. "The fire investigator's report." He held her gaze without any expression of surprise at the question, which meant he had been waiting for the right moment to tell her this. "I filed a request with the county," he said. "Requested a formal investigation into the cause of the fire. Origin point, how it spread, whether there's any evidence of accelerant." He paused. Alderson agreed it was the right step. She stared at him. "You did that without telling me. I was going to tell you today." His voice was even. "I didn't want to raise the possibility until I knew the county would actually send someone. They confirmed yesterday. Investigator named Marsh comes Thursday." She stood with that information for a moment. He had been moving pieces she didn't know about. Quietly, efficiently, without announcing himself the way he did everything. She wanted to be irritated. She was a little irritated because she was not a woman who appreciated being managed, even by someone with good intentions. But underneath the irritation was something warmer and more complicated. He had thought of it before she did, and he had moved on it. "Next time," she said carefully. "Tell me when you do something like that. I don't care how small it seems. I want to know." He met her eyes. "Fair enough." Davies came back with the last of the order, and they loaded it and drove out of Millhaven, and the town watched them go with its small-town eyes, and Josephine sat straight on the wagon bench and refused to feel like she was retreating, because she wasn't. She was moving forward. She just had a longer road than she'd hoped. Choo. Investigator Marsh arrived Thursday morning and turned out to be a compact, weathered man in his early 50s who moved around the ruins of the farmhouse with the patient, systematic attention of someone who had done this a great many times and had learned that fires told stories if you knew how to read them. Josephine stood at the edge of the ruin site and watched him work. She had asked to be present. Alderson had advised against it. Henry had said it was her right and left the decision to her. She was there. Marsh found 3 things in the first 2 hours that changed the shape of everything. The first was the origin point. Not the kitchen wall where Josephine had first seen the fire. The fire had started at 2 points simultaneously. one on the exterior of the kitchen wall, and one on the exterior of the mudroom wall. The mudroom where the back door was. The door with the hook and eye latch. Two simultaneous origin points on the exterior of the building. Marsh crouched at the base of the mudroom foundation for a long time. He took samples of the remaining char with a small scraper and placed them in labeled glass tubes. He did not say anything to Josephine while he worked. He was a man who saved his words for when they meant something. The second thing he found was a line of char along the exterior of the mudroom wall that ran in a pattern inconsistent with a fire spreading from a single point. The pattern suggested not confirmed, yet he was careful to use that word, suggested that something had been applied along the base of the wall. Something that burned fast and hot. The third thing was a small ceramic container, mostly melted but recognizable in shape, found in the grass beyond the mudroom wall, where it might have been thrown after use. Marsh stood up, dusted off his knees, and walked to where Josephine was standing. He looked at her for a moment with those patient eyes. "Miss Parker," he said carefully, "when you first noticed the fire, where exactly were you and what were you doing?" She told him, in precise detail. The dish she'd been washing, the smell, the crack in the wall. She had given this account so many times now that it came out clean and sequential without hesitation. He listened. "And the fire in the kitchen wall, when you first saw it, was it burning from the inside out or the outside in?" She paused. She thought about it honestly, the way you have to think about a sensory memory, not reaching for the answer you want, but for the actual image stored in your body. "Outside in," she said. "The crack in the wall was where I first saw it, and the fire was coming through that crack from the other side of the wood." Marsh nodded slowly. "The accelerant, if that's what it is, and I'm not confirming that yet, would have been applied to the exterior walls before you noticed anything inside." He looked at the ruin site. Someone would have needed to be outside the house to do that, after dark, while the household was presumably asleep. Josephine looked at him. Or while one person in the household was waiting for it. Marsh met her eyes. I was a county investigator. He dealt in evidence and procedure and things that could be measured and documented. And he was not going to speculate out loud in front of a woman who was a party to an active legal proceeding. But he did not disagree with her. "I'll have the samples analyzed," he said. "Results in 10 to 14 days. He walked back toward his horse, then stopped and half-turned. "The ceramic container," he said. "Do you recognize it? The shape, the color? Would it be something that belonged to the household?" She thought carefully. "No," she said. "Nothing I recognize." He nodded, wrote something in his notebook, walked to his horse and rode away without looking back. Josephine stood at the edge of the ruined site alone and looked at the place where the house had been and thought about Ruth Calloway dressed and packed with a travel bag in her hand, standing 20 yards away and watching it all burn. She had brought the fire with her. She had set it herself, or had it set, and then she had come inside and waited for just the right moment. Waited until the fire was well established, until escape through the interior would be nearly impossible, and then she had walked out and latched the door. The travel bag, the good coat, the flat pale eyes watching the flames. She had planned every detail. And a girl who was supposed to be nothing, who was supposed to leave no evidence, and no heirs, and no claims on 40% of a dead man's land, had crawled through a window and survived. Josephine pressed her hand flat against the cold air where the mudroom wall had been. "I'm still here," she said. Not to anyone. To the burned ground and the open air, and whatever remained of 6 years of her life in the ash beneath her feet. "I'm still here." She walked back to where Henry was waiting with the wagon, and she got in, and she said, "2 origin points, exterior, possible accelerant, a container he found in the grass." Henry's hands tightened once on the reins. Just once. "That's everything," he said quietly. "That's everything," she agreed. They drove home. The days that followed had their own rhythm. The rhythm of waiting on legal processes that moved at the speed of institutions, which is to say, slowly and with tremendous friction, while everything urgent and human moved at a different speed entirely underneath them. Josephine threw herself into the ranch work in the way she had discovered worked best for her when her mind needed a task to keep it from eating itself. She learned quickly, partly because she was naturally capable, and partly because hard physical work was something she understood. She had kept Ruth Calloway's house running for 6 years, mostly on her own, and whatever that experience had taken from her, it had also given her a strong back and a practical mind. Henry watched her work without commenting on it. He offered instruction when it was useful and left her alone when it wasn't, which was exactly the right calibration for a person who needed competence like she needed air. One morning, near the end of the second week after the filing, she was in the horse paddock working with the young bay mare that Henry had been trying to settle for 3 months, and she had her hand on the mare's neck and was talking to her in a low, even voice, and she heard Henry's footstep behind her and said without turning, "She's been handled rough somewhere before. You can feel it in the way she tenses before she decides to trust." A pause. "I know," Henry said from behind her. "I bought her from a man I should have looked harder at. She's not ruined." Josephine kept her voice steady, kept her hand still. "She's just learned that hands mean something bad is coming. You have to show her it doesn't, every time, until she starts to expect something different." The mare exhaled. Long and slow and deliberate, the particular exhale of a frightened animal, deciding to give the present moment one more chance. Josephine felt Henry looking at her. She didn't turn around. She was focused on the mare, but she felt the quality of attention he was giving her, which was different from the practical, respectful attention he gave everything on the ranch. It had a different weight to it. She'd been aware of it for days, the way you become aware of a sound you initially mistook for background noise and then realize has been there all along. She filed it away. She was not ready to look at it directly. There was too much else happening, and she was not a woman who did things before she was ready. The mare dropped her head. "There," Josephine said softly. The letter from Ruth's lawyer arrived on a Tuesday. Mrs. Brecken brought it in from the post with the rest of the mail and set it on the kitchen table, without comment. Though the careful way she put it down told Josephine she'd read the return address. Josephine opened it. It was 4 pages. Dense, formal, full of legal language that she was becoming better at reading by the week. She went through it twice before she felt she had the shape of it. Ruth Calloway, through her lawyer. A man named Pruitt, based in the county seat, with a reputation Alderson had described to Josephine as expensive and willing, was filing a counterclaim. The counterclaim argued 3 things: that Josephine was mentally unfit to manage her own affairs due to trauma and instability, that the legal filing was motivated by a manipulative third party, and that the original estate settlement had been signed willingly and should stand. The third party, not named but unmistakably indicated, was Henry Sullivan. Josephine read that part 3 times. Then she set the letter down on the table and looked at the window and breathed. They were coming for Henry now. Ruth had calculated correctly that removing his credibility as a witness and as a supporting party would significantly weaken Josephine's position. She was claiming that he had a financial interest in the outcome, that he was using Josephine's claim to gain access to the Parker land, that his apparent generosity was the generosity of a man who expected to be paid. She heard his boots on the porch. He came in and saw her face and saw the letter and sat down across from her without being invited, which was something she'd noticed he did. Moved directly to where he was needed without asking whether he should. She pushed the letter across the table. He read it. She watched him read it. His face was still throughout the way his face always was, but she had learned his face over the past weeks. The way you learn a place you spend a great deal of time in. She could see where the stillness was effortful and where it was natural, and right now there was something moving underneath it that was not quite anger, but was its close neighbor. He set the letter down. "She's saying you're being manipulated," Josephine said. "By me, or that I'm being manipulated by you. The direction shifts depending on the paragraph." "The direction doesn't matter to her," Henry said. "What matters is the contamination. If she can make the court think there's a financial motive underlying your claim, it changes the complexion of everything." "Is there—" She held his gaze. "A financial motive? Do you have an interest in the Parker land?" The question had to be asked. She asked it cleanly, without accusation, looking straight at him. He looked back at her with the same directness. No. No elaboration, no defensive explanation, just the word flat and certain. She held his gaze for 2 full seconds. She believed him, not because she was naive, and not because she wanted to. Because in 6 weeks of living at close quarters with Henry Sullivan, she had watched him be exactly one consistent thing in every circumstance: honest. Plain, practical, unperformative honesty. The kind that didn't need audience or credit. Ruth Calloway had spent 20 years performing virtue and hiding greed. Henry Sullivan spent every day being what he appeared to be. The difference was something Josephine had enough experience now to recognize. "Then we answer the counterclaim," she said, "directly and completely. We document everything, every conversation, every decision, every day since the fire. We show there's no financial angle because there isn't one. Alderson will want to meet tomorrow. I know." She pulled the letter back and looked at it again. "There's something else." She pointed to a clause near the end of the second page. "She's requesting an emergency hearing. She wants a judge to order me to vacate this property on the grounds that my presence here is evidence of the manipulative relationship she's alleging." Henry was very still. "She wants you removed from the ranch. Before the hearing on the estate. She knows that if I'm somewhere without support, without resources, without—" Josephine stopped, pressed her lips together. "She's trying to get me alone. She knows what she can do with me when I'm alone." She had said more than she intended, showed more than she intended. The old fear, not the fear of fire, not the fear of courts, but the original fear, the one built from 6 years of isolation and control, moved through her quickly, and she pushed it back with both hands. Henry leaned forward. "She will not get you alone." His voice was quiet. Absolute. Not a reassurance. A statement of fact with the weight of a decision behind it. "Whatever the court orders, whatever happens at the hearing, we make arrangements that ensure you have a stable place and legal support. Alderson can file to challenge the emergency request. She doesn't have grounds you're here voluntarily as a guest. There's nothing improper, and the request itself is a transparent attempt to disadvantage a plaintiff. Alderson will say the same," she said. "He'll say it better, and he'll put it in the filing." Henry sat back. "But Josephine." He waited until she met his eyes. "The counterclaim. Her arguing I have a financial motive. It's going to get worse before the hearing. She's going to tell people. People in town, people connected to the court. There's going to be talk. About you and me." She looked at him steadily. "There already is." He accepted that without surprise. "I need you to know," he said, "that it doesn't affect what I'm willing to do here. Whatever she says about my motives, my position doesn't change." She sat across from him in the kitchen, where she had eaten 6 weeks of breakfasts, and come in from 6 weeks of ranch work, and sat through 6 weeks of evenings with a cup of coffee going cold in her hands, and she thought about the mare in the paddock that morning, the one who'd been handled rough, and learned that hands meant something bad was coming. She was still learning it could be different. Not all the way there yet. But learning. "I know," she said quietly. "And I need you to know what happens at the hearing. Whatever she says about me, I'm not going away." The corner of his mouth moved. Just slightly. It was as close to a smile as he usually got. "I know that," he said. The emergency hearing was set for 2 weeks out. Alderson filed the challenge the same day, and was reasonably confident his word, and he used it carefully, that the emergency request would be denied. But reasonably confident was not certainly, and the 2 weeks between the filing and the hearing were the longest and strangest and most suspended Josephine had ever lived through. She woke early. She worked hard. She spent her evenings at the kitchen table with Alderson's documents spread out and a lamp burning low while she read and made notes and built the clearest possible record of everything she knew. Henry worked beside her on his own ranch business sometimes, and they sat across the table from each other in the quiet hours with their separate papers and their separate tasks and their shared lamp. And it was the most natural thing she had ever been part of, and also, somehow, the most startling, because she had never been in a room with another person and felt this whatever. This was uncomplicated, peaceful, companionable, ordinary presence. She had not known it could simply exist without being performed or managed or survived. It frightened her a little. She was honest with herself about that. Not him. Not him specifically. Just the size of it. Just the fact that something this ordinary could feel this significant. She kept her eyes on her papers and let it be what it was. The night before the hearing, Josephine could not sleep again. She sat in the chair by the drafty window, the way she had the very first night, and she thought everything through from the beginning. Not because she doubted any of it, but because going through it gave her something to hold on to. The facts, the sequence, the things she knew were true and could prove. She heard a quiet knock at the door. "Come in." Mrs. Brecken opened the door, looked at the chair and sighed with the unsurprised affection of a woman who had given up expecting other people to sleep when they should. She was carrying 2 cups of coffee. She came in, sat on the edge of the bed, and handed Josephine a cup. "I heard you," she said simply. Chair creaking. "I'm a light sleeper." "I'm sorry. I'll try to stay still." "Don't be foolish." Mrs. Brecken wrapped both hands around her own cup. "How are you feeling about tomorrow?" Honest answer. I wouldn't ask otherwise. Josephine looked at her cup. Afraid. Not of what I have to do or what I have to say, but of, she tried to find the word, of what it means if it doesn't work, if the judge grants her request, if she manages to make the court believe. She stopped. That you're unstable and being manipulated. Mrs. Brecken said it plainly without the careful softening Josephine had been doing. She won't. You sound certain. I'm certain about what I've seen in this house. Mrs. Brecken looked at her over her cup with the direct gaze of a woman who had watched more things clearly than most people gave her credit for. I've worked for Henry Sullivan for 11 years. I've watched him hire hands and deal with buyers and handle disputes and make hard decisions. He is not a man who does things for hidden reasons. He saw someone who needed help, and he helped. That's the beginning and end of it. Ruth will say otherwise. Ruth Calloway can say whatever she likes. Mrs. Brecken took a sip of coffee. Saying a thing doesn't make it true, and this county has been watching Henry Sullivan for a long time. They know the kind of man he is. That counts for something. Josephine looked at her. And me? She asked it quietly. What does this county think of me? Mrs. Brecken was quiet for a moment, the honest silence of someone not reaching for comfort, but for truth. They're making up their minds, she said finally. A lot of them have heard Ruth's story, and not yours. But tomorrow, they'll start hearing yours. She set down her cup and stood up. And you tell a very different kind of story than she does, Josephine. Because yours is true. And it sounds true. And people who pay attention can hear the difference. She picked up her cup and went to the door. Drink your coffee, she said. Try to rest. And tomorrow just tell them what happened. The same way you've told it to me and to Henry and to Alderson. Clear and plain and without performance. She paused at the door. You've survived things that would have broken most people. Walking into a courtroom and telling the truth is going to be nothing. She went out. Josephine sat in the chair in the dark and drank her coffee and turned it over. Clear and plain and without performance. She could do that. She had learned in the burning house and in the cold field and in 6 weeks on a ranch that was not hers and was somehow becoming home, that the only thing she had ever had, the only thing Ruth Calloway had never been able to take, was the clear, unperformable fact of what had actually happened. She had it still. She would walk into that courtroom and lay it down on the table and let it be what it was. And if it was enough, if the truth was enough, which she had been told all her life it should be and had spent most of her life watching it, failed to be then, tomorrow would be the beginning of something. And if it wasn't enough tomorrow, she would come back the day after. And the day after that. Because she was still here. And she was not going anywhere, and she meant it the way you mean something when you've stopped saying it for other people and started saying it for yourself, when the words stop being performance and start being bone. She had made that decision in the dark of the drafty room, and she carried it with her into the morning like something physical, something she could feel in her hands. The courthouse in Mill Haven was a 2-story building that smelled like old wood and paper, and the particular kind of authority that accumulates in a place where decisions have been made for a long time. Josephine had walked past it 100 times in her life, and never once imagined herself inside it. She walked in now with Alderson on her left and Henry Sullivan one step behind her, and she kept her chin level and her hands still, and she looked straight ahead. The hearing room was smaller than she expected. Plain benches on both sides, a long table at the front, a raised platform for the judge. She had pictured something more imposing and was briefly irrationally grateful that it wasn't. Ruth Calloway was already there. She was seated at this table on the right side with Pruitt beside her, the expensive and willing lawyer from the county seat who turned out to be a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with a practiced courtroom stillness that Josephine recognized immediately as the professional version of Ruth's own cultivated composure. Two of a kind. She filed that observation away. Ruth did not look at Josephine when she entered. That was deliberate too, the studied non-acknowledgement of someone who had decided that looking would cost her something. Josephine sat down at the left table beside Alderson. She put her hands flat on the table in front of her and breathed. Henry sat in the gallery directly behind her. She could feel him there the way you feel a solid wall behind you in a dark room, not touching, not speaking, just there. The judge entered, not Harmer. The change of venue request had succeeded on that point. At least this was a Judge Callum from the District 2 counties north, a lean man in his 60s with spectacles and the no-nonsense economy of movement of someone with a full docket and a low tolerance for theater. He sat. He looked at his papers. He looked at the room. "We're here on an emergency motion filed by Mrs. Ruth Calloway, requesting temporary vacatur of Miss Josephine Parker from the private property of Mr. Henry Sullivan, on the grounds that Miss Parker's presence constitutes evidence of an improper relationship bearing on the pending estate dispute." He looked up over his spectacles. "Mr. Pruitt, you filed this motion. Convince me it isn't a waste of my time." Pruitt rose smoothly. He had a voice built for rooms like this, measured resonant, carrying the precise weight of reasonableness. He laid out Ruth's position in 10 clean minutes. The allegation of undue influence, the claim that Henry Sullivan had a financial interest in the estate outcome, the assertion that Josephine's mental and emotional state, following the trauma of the fire, made her susceptible to manipulation, and the argument that her continued residence at the Sullivan Ranch represented an ongoing conflict of interest that contaminated the entire proceeding. It was well constructed. Josephine listened to it and felt the old cold recognition of watching Ruth's machinery operate the careful selection of facts that were technically true, but assembled into a picture that was entirely false. Alderson rose when Pruitt finished. He was smaller than Pruitt and quieter, and he did not have that resonant courtroom voice. What he had was precision. He went through each of Pruitt's points, methodically dismantling them, the way you take apart a poorly built fence, not dramatically. Just post by post, until what had looked like a solid structure was a pile of components on the ground. Mr. Sullivan had no documented interest in the Parker estate. Mr. Sullivan had come forward voluntarily as a witness to the night of the fire, a role he had taken on before any legal proceedings were initiated. Miss Parker was residing at the Sullivan Ranch as a guest with no financial arrangement of any kind, which was the normal practice for a person who had lost their home in a fire. The emergency motion itself, Alderson noted in his careful way, had been filed the day after Miss Parker gave her formal sworn statement, a timeline that suggested the motion was less about protecting the integrity of the proceeding and more about disrupting it. Judge Callum listened to all of this with his hands folded on the platform and his face giving nothing away. When Alderson sat down, the judge looked at his papers for a full 30 seconds of silence that had weight to it. "Mr. Pruitt," he said finally, "your client is asking this court to remove a fire survivor from the only stable housing she has had access to since her home burned down on the basis of an allegation of improper influence that you have supported with inference rather than evidence. I need something more concrete than inference." Pruitt rose again. "Your Honor, the nature of undue influence is that it—" "I know the nature of undue influence, Mr. Pruitt. I've been on this bench for 19 years. Callum looked at him steadily. "What evidence specifically do you have that Mr. Sullivan has taken any action for financial gain relating to the Parker estate?" "A beat. The specific kind of beat that happens in a courtroom when a lawyer reaches for something and finds less than he expected. The pattern of behavior, Your Honor." "Pattern." Callum wrote something. Miss Parker. He looked directly at Josephine. You may speak if you choose. You are not required to. Josephine stood. She had not expected to be addressed directly. She felt Alderson start to rise beside her, and she put one hand briefly on his arm. Not hard, just a touch, and he sat back. Your Honor. Her voice came out the way she'd practiced it in her head since Mrs. Brecken's words last night. Clear and plain, and without performance. I am at Mr. Sullivan's ranch because I have nowhere else to go. My home burned down. My stepmother has apparently forged legal documents claiming my inheritance. A fire investigator has found evidence that the fire may have been deliberately set. I have a sworn statement, a handwriting examination, and a pending forensic analysis that support everything I've filed. She looked at Callum directly. Mr. Sullivan has asked nothing of me. He has given me a place to stay and access to a lawyer and his testimony about what he witnessed the night of the fire. If that constitutes improper influence, then every person in this county who has ever helped a neighbor in trouble is also guilty of it. The room was very quiet. Callum looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Pruitt. Motion denied. He said it without ceremony, the way you set down a tool when the job is done. The emergency request lacks sufficient evidential basis. Miss Parker will remain where she is. We'll set the substantive hearing on the estate matter for... He consulted his calendar. 6 weeks from Thursday. Mr. Alderson. I understand there's a forensic report pending. Yes, Your Honor. Fire investigators' analysis. Expected within the next 10 days. Have it filed the moment you receive it. I want it in the record before the substantive hearing. He looked at both tables. Both parties are reminded that any attempt to transfer, encumber, or liquidate assets connected to the Parker estate prior to the substantive hearing will be treated as contempt. Are we clear? Yes, Your Honor. Alderson's voice was professionally neutral, but Josephine heard what was underneath it. Yes, Your Honor. Pruitt's voice was the same with different things underneath it. Callum stood. The room stood. He left. And it was done. Josephine stood at the table for a moment after the room began to move around her. She heard Pruitt murmur something to Ruth. She heard Alderson exhale quietly beside her. She heard the shuffle of the gallery rising. She heard Henry's voice directly behind her, low and even. You didn't need me to say a word. She turned around. Howe was looking at her with that complete, uncomplicated attention, and there was something in his face that she had not seen there before. Not pride exactly, because he was not a man who wore pride on his face about other people's accomplishments, but something adjacent to it, something warmer. Recognition, maybe. The specific recognition of seeing someone show you who they really are. I needed you to be here, she said. He held her gaze. Then I was useful, he said. Ruth Calloway left the courthouse without speaking to Josephine. She walked through the side door with Pruitt at her elbow, and she did not look back, and Josephine watched her go and felt something she had not anticipated. Not triumph, not relief. Something quieter and stranger. The sensation of watching a door close that had been open all her life, through which cold air had been blowing for as long as she could remember. It was still closed. The cold air was still there somewhere, but the door was finally measurably closer to shut. Outside the courthouse, Alderson pulled her aside while Henry spoke to a man from the county clerk's office. That went better than expected, Alderson said carefully. Callum is fair. Harmer would have found a way to grant the motion regardless of the evidence. Callum reads the papers and makes decisions based on what's in them. He looked at her over his spectacles. Your statement to the court was effective. Very effective. I just told the truth. Yes. He said it in the tone of a man who had watched many people fail to do exactly that when it mattered. That's what made it effective. I went to speak to Henry, and Josephine stood on the steps of the courthouse in the cold air and looked at Millhaven, its main street, its familiar storefronts. Mrs. Gale's dry goods, the feed store, the bank where her father's accounts had once lived, the church where she'd sat beside Ruth for 6 years and said prayers that felt like they went nowhere. She had known this town her whole life. She had been invisible in it for most of that time. Today she had stood up in a room in the middle of it and spoken plainly and been heard. It was not nothing. It was, in fact, quite a lot. The forensic report came 9 days later. Alderson sent a writer to the ranch with a sealed copy and a note in his handwriting that said, "Only, read this before you come to town. Then come to town." Josephine read it at the kitchen table with Henry across from her and Mrs. Brecken conspicuously busy at the far end of the kitchen. Marsh had been thorough. The report ran to 14 pages of technical language that Josephine worked through, carefully annotating the margins, the way she'd been doing with all the legal documents for weeks. By page 6, she had understood the conclusion. By page 14, she had understood the full weight of it. The samples from the exterior of the mudroom wall contained traces of a petroleum-based accelerant. The ceramic container found in the grass beyond the wall was consistent with a common lamp oil vessel, a type sold at hardware and dry goods stores throughout the county. The two simultaneous origin points on the exterior of the structure were definitively inconsistent with accidental ignition. In Marsh's professional opinion, stated in the careful, conditional language of an official report, the fire was deliberately set from outside the structure, most likely within the 30 to 60 minutes prior to the time Miss Parker first observed the fire from inside the building. Deliberate. From outside. 30 to 60 minutes prior. Josephine set the report down and looked at the table. Ruth Calloway had set, or had paid someone to set the fire, while Josephine and Ruth herself were both inside the house. She had set it and then gone back inside and dressed and packed her travel bag and waited. Waited with the knowledge of what was burning below while Josephine slept. Waited until the fire was established enough that escape through the interior would be nearly impossible, and then she had come to the door and walked out and latched it. The premeditation of it, the coldness, the willingness to sit in a burning house to risk her own presence in it, in order to make sure she had an alibi for the timing of her departure. Josephine felt sick, not with weakness, with the specific nausea of confronting a cruelty so complete and so calculated that the mind resists it the way a body resists poison. Josephine. Henry's voice was quiet. She looked up. "I'm all right." She straightened her spine. "I'm all right. She pressed her hand flat on the report. "I knew it. I've known it for weeks. But seeing it written out like this in official language, it makes it—" She stopped. "Real," he said. "Real," she agreed. She pulled the report back toward her and looked at the last page. "This changes the estate proceeding," she said. "This isn't just forgery anymore. This is evidence of criminal intent. Alderson will want to bring this to the county prosecutor." Henry was very still across from her. "That's a different fight," he said. "A harder one, longer, more public." "I know. Ruth will fight it with everything she has. Prewitt will go after Marsh's methodology, his credentials, the chain of custody on the samples. She'll find someone to contradict him." "I know." Josephine looked at him. "She tried to kill me, Henry." It was the first time she had used his given name. She heard it happen and did not take it back. He heard it too. She saw it register just barely, just a slight change in the quality of his attention. "I know she did," he said quietly. "Then you know I cannot let it stop at the estate." She held his gaze. "She'll do it again. To someone. If she walks away from this with nothing worse than losing the land, she'll find another way to do it again." She pressed her lips together. "I can't be the reason that happens." He looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said. "You can't." He stood and picked up his hat from the hook. "I'll ride with you to Alderson." Alderson read the report without speaking. He read it twice the way he read everything important, once for content, once for implication. When he set it down, he took off his spectacles and set them on the desk and rubbed his eyes with the heels of his hands, which was the closest thing to an emotional response Josephine had seen from him. "This goes to the prosecutor," he said. "Today, I'll take it myself." What does that mean for the estate hearing? It strengthens it enormously. A finding of criminal intent underlying the estate fraud makes it nearly impossible for any judge to look at the original settlement as anything other than what it was. He put his spectacles back on. But it also means Ruth Calloway is now facing something considerably beyond a civil matter. Prewitt will know that the moment this hits the prosecutor's desk. He may advise her to negotiate. Josephine went still. Negotiate, she repeated. A settlement on the estate in exchange for certain considerations regarding the criminal matter. It's a possibility. He looked at her carefully. Is that something you would consider? She thought about it. Honestly, which meant sitting with the discomfort of it, the part of her that wanted Ruth Calloway to answer for every single thing she had done, and the part of her that was exhausted and had a life to build and understood that the legal system moved slowly and expensively and imperfectly. What would the terms look like? She asked. Full restoration of your portion of the estate, immediate transfer, legal fees covered from the estate assets. Alderson folded his hands. On the criminal side, that's not my territory, and it would be the prosecutor's call, not mine or yours. But your cooperation and your testimony, and whether you support prosecution or a negotiated resolution, will carry weight with his office. Josephine looked at Henry. He looked back at her. It's your decision, he said simply. Not mine, not Alderson's. She turned back to Alderson. File with the prosecutor, she said. Let her see what's coming. Then we find out if she negotiates. She picked up her gloves from the desk. If she does, I want to hear the terms before I agree to anything. And whatever happens with the criminal matter, I want it on record, all of it. What she did, what the investigation found. Even if it doesn't go to trial, I want it on record. Alderson nodded. That I can arrange. Then let's proceed. Word travels fast, in a small county, when it wants to. By the end of the week, Millhaven knew about the forensic report. Not the details, those were in a sealed filing, but the shape of it. That there had been an investigation. That the investigation had found something. That Ruth Calloway had been seen entering Pruitt's office 3 times in 4 days, which was not the behavior of a woman who was confident in her position. Josephine felt the town shift around her, the way she'd felt it the morning in Mrs. Gale's dry goods, except this time in the other direction. People who had been carefully neutral began to be carefully warm. Mrs. Gale herself stopped her on the street one Thursday and said without preamble, I told my husband last month I didn't believe Ruth Calloway's story. I knew that girl. Her father was a good man. She didn't get anything from him. She said it as if it were a thing she'd always believed, and Josephine let her have that revision because she needed allies more than she needed credit for being right sooner. Thank you, Mrs. Gale, she said and meant it. At the ranch. The days continued their rhythm. There was always work. There was always the particular satisfaction of physical labor, in a place where the results were visible, the fence that was fixed, the stall that was cleaned, the horse that was calmer today than yesterday. The young bay mare trusted her now. She didn't make a thing of it, but she noticed it. The way the mare came to the paddock fence when she appeared in the yard, the way she dropped her head almost immediately when Josephine put a hand on her neck. Henry had noticed it too. She'd caught him watching from the barn doorway one morning with an expression she was no longer pretending she didn't understand. She wasn't ready. There was still too much unresolved, too much in motion, too many pieces of her life that had not yet landed in their proper places. She was not the kind of woman who could let something grow in good soil until she knew the ground was stable. She'd learned that about herself in the past 2 months, the hard particular way that people learn things about themselves when everything they'd built their understanding on has burned away. But she was aware of it. She was letting herself be aware of it. And for Josephine Parker, awareness without flinching away was its own kind of progress. Pruitt's letter arrived on a Monday. It was addressed to Alderson. Alderson forwarded it to Josephine with a note. As I thought. Read and tell me how you'd like to proceed. Ruth Calloway was prepared to negotiate. The terms were close to what Alderson had outlined. Full transfer of Josephine's 40% legal fees covered, and a stipulation that Josephine would not actively support criminal prosecution. Pruitt had worded this last point in careful legalese, but the meaning was plain. Ruth wanted immunity, or as close to it as she could get in exchange for the land. Josephine sat with the letter for a full day. She walked the fence line on the north side of the ranch, the one Henry hadn't sent Davies to check, the one he'd been meaning to get to himself, the one she'd started doing because it gave her a long, uninterrupted walk and a practical task at the end of it. She walked it and thought and let the thinking happen without pushing it toward any particular answer. She came back to the kitchen and found Henry there with coffee already made because he knew her rhythms. Now the way she knew his, quietly and without discussion. The way two people learn each other when they share a space with honest attention. She sat across from him. "The terms are close to what Alderson said," she told him. "Everything on the estate side. But she wants me to stand back from the criminal matter." He poured her coffee and didn't say anything yet. "I've been thinking about what it means," she continued. "If I agree, she gets the land stripped from her, she loses everything she built through the forgery, she gets exposed publicly." Alderson said, "The record stands regardless. The facts are documented. Anyone who looks will find them." She wrapped her hands around the cup. "But she doesn't face a trial. She doesn't face a criminal court." "Is that enough?" Henry asked quietly. The question was direct and without judgment, which was why she could answer it honestly. "I don't know," she said. "Part of me, the part that's been afraid for 6 years, wants her to stand in a court of law and have everything said out loud in front of a jury." She looked at her coffee. "And part of me knows that criminal trials are long and brutal, and she has Pruitt and money and connections, and there is a real possibility that even with Marsh's report and Voss's testimony and my sworn statement, a jury convicts on reasonable doubt, and she walks. And if she walks from a criminal trial, she walks with nothing on paper. She walks with the ability to tell people the jury found her innocent." Josephine looked up. "With the negotiated settlement, everything goes into the record. The forgery, the forensic finding, all of it. And she loses the land. She loses everything my father built." Her voice was steady. "She can't profit from what she did. And everyone who looks can see what she did. That matters." Henry looked at her for a long moment. "Then it sounds like you've already decided." She turned her cup in her hands. "Tell me I'm not letting her off easy." "You're not." His voice was certain. "You're being strategic. There's a difference. Letting her off easy would be walking away from all of it because you're tired. What you're doing is calculating the best possible outcome and choosing it." He looked at her steadily. "Your father's land goes back to you. What she did is documented permanently. She loses every material thing she stole." He paused. "That's not easy. That's thorough." She breathed. "I'm going to tell Alderson to negotiate the terms," she said. "But I want one addition, something she has to sign that isn't just legal language." She looked at him. "I want a written acknowledgement, not buried in a filing. A plain language statement signed by her that she forged my signature and that she left me in that house knowing I might not get out. I want it in plain English." Henry looked at her. "Pruitt will push back hard on that. I know, but it's my condition." She set down her cup. "She spent 6 years making me believe that my understanding of what was happening to me was wrong. That I was confused, ungrateful, imagining things. I need it in writing, in words that anyone can read, that I wasn't confused, that I was right about what she was." She met his eyes. "I need that, not for the court, for myself." Something crossed Henry's face. Something she didn't have a name for yet, but recognized a kind of pain that wasn't his and a kind of respect that was. He nodded slowly. "Then that's your condition," he said. "And it's a fair one." She stood up. "I'll go to Alderson in the morning." She started toward the hallway, and then stopped and turned. He was still at the table, cup in his hands, watching her with that quality of attention she'd stopped pretending she didn't notice. Henry. The name still felt new in her mouth. Good new. Like something she'd been reaching for without knowing it. "Yeah." He looked at her steadily. "Thank you." She held his gaze. "Not for tonight. For all of it. For all of them, the fire and the lawyer and the courtroom and the fence line and the mayor and all of it." She pressed her lips together briefly. "I know I've said it before. I wanted to say it again when I meant the full size of it." He was quiet for a moment. "You earned every piece of it yourself," he said. "I just didn't get out of the way." It was such a Henry Sullivan thing to say. Redirecting credit with absolute sincerity, not from modesty, but from genuine accuracy, because he was a man who paid careful attention to what was actually true. That she felt the thing in her chest open, another fraction, that careful cracking open that had started the night of the fire and had been proceeding slowly and thoroughly ever since. She went to bed. In the morning, she went to Alderson. She presented her condition. Prewitt pushed back for 2 weeks. Ruth apparently did not want to sign a plain language acknowledgement. Ruth wanted the legal language, the buried clauses, the plausible deniability of terminology that only lawyers read. Josephine did not move. Not an inch. Not a word. Not a softening of the condition. She sat in Alderson's office and waited and let Ruth Calloway understand for the first time what it felt like to be on the other side of someone who was not going to be managed or worn down or frightened into giving up what she had a right to. After 14 days of negotiation, Ruth Calloway signed the plain language acknowledgement. Josephine read it the evening it arrived, held the paper in both hands in the kitchen with the lamp burning low, and read every word of it. Ruth's handwriting. Ruth's signature. A clear, unambiguous, plain English statement of what she had done. She set it down on the table. She did not cry. She was not a woman who cried easily, and this was not a moment for tears anyway. This was a moment for the particular stillness that comes when something enormous and long expected finally lands. She pressed her palm flat on the paper. She thought of her father, of William Parker, with his rough hands and his easy laugh, and the land he had built for his family. And she thought, "It's done, Pa. She can't touch it anymore. She can't touch any of it." She folded the paper carefully, put it in the box where she kept the legal documents, closed the box, walked out to the porch. The night was cold and clear, and the stars were the brilliant particular stars of a rural sky in autumn, and she stood in the cold air and breathed it in and let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened. Behind her, the screen door opened and closed quietly. Henry came and stood beside her, not close enough to touch, just there the way he was always just there, solid and unhurried and present. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he agreed. She looked at the stars, at the wide, dark sky over land that was hers now, or would be officially, when the transfer completed. Her father's land, her inheritance. The 40% of something he had built with his hands that he had always intended to leave to her. "I want to rebuild," she said. "Not the farmhouse. Something different. Something new." She turned to look at Henry. "On my land. Something that's mine from the beginning." Howe was looking at her with that quality of attention she had finally fully stopped pretending she didn't feel. "Then you'll rebuild," he said. And in his voice was not a question, not a promise, but something solid and plain and true. The voice of a man who had made no declarations and needed to make none, because what he meant was visible in everything he had done since the night he rode toward a fire that other people watched from a distance. Josephine looked at him. She let herself look. All the way without the careful management she'd been applying for months. She saw what she'd been seeing for a long time. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to say anything yet, but she stopped looking away. And that for Josephine Parker, who had spent 6 years learning that every open door led to another locked one, was the bravest thing she had done since she crawled through a broken window in the dark with glass in her arm, and landed in the cold dirt of a field, and found against everything she'd been taught to expect that she was still alive and standing on Henry Sullivan's porch under a winter sky. Finally letting herself look at something she had been carefully not looking at for months. She understood that surviving was not the same as living, and that she had only just in this moment begun the second thing. She went inside before the cold drove her in. Henry followed a few minutes later. Neither of them said anything more that night, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind, the kind that doesn't need filling, that has its own texture and warmth. She had not known that kind of silence existed between two people until she came to this ranch. She had thought silence was always what Ruth Calloway's silences were: weaponized, loaded, designed to make you feel small. She knew better now. She knew a great many things better now. The estate transfer was completed 3 weeks later on a Tuesday morning in Alderson's office, with 2 witnesses and a notary and a stack of papers that Josephine signed in her own hand, her real hand, the one with the characteristic capital P that Voss had identified and that Ruth had tried and failed to replicate. Each signature felt like something being returned to her. Not just property, not just land and accounts and the material remains of her father's life's work. Something more fundamental. The legal confirmation that she was a person with standing with rights, with a claim on the world that no one could erase by pressing a pen to paper in her name while she slept. When the last page was signed and witnessed, and the notary had pressed his seal, and Alderson had shaken her hand, with something approaching warmth, she walked out of the office and stood on the main street of Millhaven, in the thin winter light, and felt the full weight of it settle into her body. She owned land, her father's land, her land now fully and legally and permanently. Henry was waiting outside with the wagon. He had not come into the office, she had not asked him to, and he had understood without explanation that this was something she needed to do in her own name, with her own hands, witnessed by no one who had any stake in the outcome except herself. She climbed up onto the bench beside him. He looked at her face and read it the way he read everything directly and without over-interpretation. "Done?" he asked. "Done," she said. He picked up the reins. The wagon moved, and Josephine Parker rode through the town she'd grown up in as its own person for the first time in her adult life, and the feeling was so large and so clean that she couldn't hold it all at once and had to let parts of it go and come back for them later, the way you do with things too big to carry in a single trip. She told him on a Wednesday. Not because Wednesday was significant, because it was the day she was ready and she had learned through the fire and the courtroom and the 14 days of negotiation over a plain language acknowledgement that waiting past readiness was its own kind of cowardice, and she was finished with cowardice in all its forms. She had been at the ranch for nearly 4 months. The winter had settled in properly, and the days were short and cold, and the work was different from the fall work feeding stock and checking water lines and keeping the barn warm. She had learned all of it. She had learned it with the particular intensity of a person who had found late something she was genuinely good at and genuinely wanted to be good at. Henry was in the barn, mending a broken stall door when she came in, and stood in the open space in the middle and looked at him working. She had been working up to this for 3 days, and had decided twice not to do it, and had changed her mind both times because she was not, in the end, the kind of woman who backed away from things she'd decided. "I need to tell you something," she said. "And I need you to let me finish before you say anything." He set down his tools and turned to look at her. Just that full attention, no defense, no performance. The way he always listened. She breathed. "When you pulled me out of that fire, I thought you were doing what any decent person would do. I told myself that for 2 months. I told myself you were decent and practical, and that your kindness was the ordinary kindness of a good neighbor, and that I would be a fool to read anything more into it than that." She held his gaze. "I was telling myself that because I was afraid. Not of you. Of what it meant if I stopped telling myself that. Of what I would have to look at directly if I let myself admit that this," she gestured between them with one hand slightly helplessly, "was something. I was very still. I am not good at this," she said honestly. "I don't have practice with it. I spent 6 years being told I was a burden, and before that I was 13 years old, and before that I was a child. So my experience with being someone that a person chooses specifically for reasons that are not obligation or convenience or calculation, my experience with that is essentially nothing." She pressed her lips together briefly. "I want you to know that. I want you to know I'm aware that what I'm saying probably sounds either very simple or very complicated, and that I'm genuinely uncertain which it is." The corner of his mouth moved. She pressed on before she lost her nerve. "I'm going to build on my land. I've been thinking about the design for 3 weeks. I know what I want it to look like, and how I want it to sit on the property, and what I want to be able to see from the front porch." She took a breath. "And every time I imagine it, you're in it. Not as a charity case, not as a neighbor, not as the man who did a decent thing one night and got stuck with the consequences." She met his eyes fully. "I imagine you in it because that's where you fit. And I don't think that's an accident, and I don't think I'm misreading something that isn't there, but I have been wrong about people before, and badly enough that I need to hear you say it plainly. Whatever it is, say it plainly." She stopped. The barn was very quiet. Henry Sullivan looked at her across the space between them with those eyes that always told the truth, even when they were keeping still. And he didn't say anything for a moment that lasted long enough for her heart to do something uncomfortable. Then he crossed the space between them in 4 steps, which was not very many steps, but it was all the steps there were, and he stopped in front of her close enough that she could see the specific gray in his eyes that she'd been cataloging without meaning to for 4 months. Josephine. Her name in his voice, the way he'd said it the first time in the hearing room, like something solid, like something chosen with precision. I rode into a burning building for you the first night I ever saw your face. She waited. I've been trying to figure out for 4 months how to say the rest of that without overstepping or making your situation harder than it already was. He looked at her steadily. You had enough to carry. I wasn't going to add to it. You weren't adding to it, she said. I was carrying it anyway. I know that now. He held her gaze. I want to be in whatever you're building, on your land or mine or anywhere. I want to be in it because you are the most... He stopped. Tried again with the precision of a man who chooses words carefully because he means them. You are the most honest person I have ever known. You walked through something that would have flattened most people, and you came out the other side knowing exactly who you were and what you deserved. I don't say that about many people. His voice was quiet. I've said it about no one else. She looked at him. The careful cracking open in her chest that had started the night of the fire and had been proceeding slowly and thoroughly for 4 months completed itself. Not with drama. Not with the dramatic rupture she might have expected. Just open. All the way through. Clean. All right, she said. All right, he said back. And that was all it needed to be for now. 2 people who meant things without ornamentation, saying them plainly, and hearing them plainly in a barn in the middle of a winter morning with the work of the day still ahead of them. He reached out and took her hand, and she let him, and neither of them made more of it than it was, and it was already quite a lot. Spring came the way. Springs do in that part of the country. Slowly, and then all at once, the cold breaking in a week, and the ground coming back to life with the particular urgency of things that have been suppressed too long. She broke ground on the house in March. Henry and Davies and 2 men from town helped with the framing. Josephine worked beside them, which none of them expected, and all of them adjusted to within the first day, because she was useful and efficient and did not ask to be accommodated. Mrs. Brecken came out on Saturdays with food and opinions about the kitchen layout, and the kitchen layout improved significantly because of both. The work was physical and satisfying and exhausting in the right way, the way that lets you sleep hard and wake ready, that leaves visible evidence of what you've done with your hands and your hours. She had not had that kind of exhaustion in 6 years. She had had the other kind, the wearing down kind, the kind that comes from effort spent not on building, but on surviving. The difference was considerable. On the first evening, after the walls were up, just the framing, just the skeleton, open to the sky, still Josephine stood inside the shell of the house that was going to be hers, and turned slowly in the space, and placed things in her mind where they would go. The kitchen there. The front room there with windows on the east side, because she had decided she wanted morning light. The porch facing south the way her father's original house had faced, because some things were worth keeping. Henry came and stood in the frame of what would be the front door. He had a streak of sawdust across his jaw and the particular tiredness of someone who had worked hard in the best possible way, and he looked at her in the open frame of her new house and did not say anything, and she turned to look at him and felt something so complete that she almost couldn't hold it all. "My father would have liked you," she said. It came out without planning, which was how she knew it was exactly true. Something moved through Henry's face. Quietly, the way things moved through his face. "Tell me about him," he said. She sat down on the subfloor, the raw wood, the bare beginning of a house, and Henry sat beside her, and she told him. Everything. Not the edited version, not the grief-smoothed version, but the real version. The rough hands, and the easy laugh, and the way he called her Josie Bird, and the fact that he wasn't a perfect man, but he was a present one, and he had loved her the way good fathers love daughters completely, and without requiring anything in return. Henry listened, the way he listened to everything. All the way through. When she finished, the light had changed, and the first stars were appearing above the open frame of her house. "He built something worth inheriting," Henry said. "He did." She looked at the stars through the frame. "And I almost didn't get to inherit it." "But you did." "But I did." She said it firmly. "The way you say things you need to hear in your own voice that become more real for having been spoken. Because I crawled through a window and landed in a field, and a man I'd never met decided to ride toward a fire instead of away from it." Henry looked at her sideways. "You would have found another way," he said, "if I hadn't come." She considered that honestly. "Maybe," she said, "but I didn't have to." He held her gaze. "No," he said quietly, "you didn't." The hardest moment came in April, and she hadn't seen it coming, which was the nature of hard moments that arrive not through crisis, but through the accumulated weight of ordinary days finally becoming too much to hold in silence. She was alone in the new house. The walls were up. The roof was half finished, and she was doing interior measurements for the kitchen when she found it. Not a legal document. Not evidence of anything. Just a small thing she'd carried without knowing she was carrying it, tucked into the bottom of the box she'd put together in the first days at the ranch, a box of the few things she'd had on her when she'd escaped the fire. A photograph. Her parents. Her actual parents. William and Catherine Parker, standing in front of the original farmhouse before the accident, before everything. Her mother was laughing at something outside the frame. Her father had his hand on her shoulder and was looking not at the camera, but at her mother, with an expression that Josephine had been too young to fully understand when she was old enough to look at this photograph, but understood completely now. How was looking at her mother, the way a person looks at someone they have chosen specifically from everything available, and would choose again. Josephine sat down on the raw floor of her unfinished house and held the photograph in both hands and let herself feel the full size of what she had lost, and what she had recovered, and what she was building, and what she still carried, and she cried. Properly, fully, without managing it, or shortening it, or apologizing to herself for it. She cried for her parents who had deserved more years. She cried for the 13-year-old girl who had been handed to a woman who saw her as a problem to be solved. She cried for 6 years of silence and isolation, and being told she was nothing. She cried for the night she had pressed her face to a burning floor and whispered a prayer she didn't believe would be answered. She cried until she was done. Then she wiped her face on her sleeve and looked at the photograph again. Her mother laughing. Her father watching her mother the way you watch something you love. She understood now, fully, what that looked like from the inside. She put the photograph carefully in her pocket and went back to measuring the kitchen. Henry found her there an hour later. He came in through the open front door and stopped when he saw her face. Not the current face, the composed working face, but whatever remained visible of what had happened an hour ago, and he didn't ask. He just came and stood beside her and held the other end of the measuring line because there was work to do, and she needed another set of hands, and he was a man who showed up. They worked in silence for 20 minutes. Then she reached into her pocket and held out the photograph. He took it, looked at it carefully the way he looked at things he wanted to actually see. "Your parents," he said. It wasn't a question. "Before the accident." She looked at the photograph in his hands. "I found it this afternoon." He held it a moment longer. Then he gave it back. "She's laughing," he said. "She laughed a lot. I don't know how much I actually remember of that and how much I've built from the photograph." She slipped it back into her pocket. "But I remember the feeling of it, that the house was the kind of house where laughing happened." Henry was quiet. "That's what you're building," he said. She looked at him. "That's what we're building," he said again, with the small, precise correction that changed everything and nothing that placed him inside the sentence where she had left a space without quite knowing she'd left it. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the walls of her house going up around her. "Yes," she said. "That's what we're building." The house was finished by the end of May. The day she moved in, the few things she'd accumulated over 7 months at the Sullivan Ranch, plus the box, plus the photograph, now framed and hung on the wall of the front room where the morning light would hit it. Mrs. Brecken came with food and fussed about the curtains and told Josephine that she was welcome at the Sullivan Ranch for supper any time she pleased, which they both understood to mean something more than the literal words. Davies came and helped carry things in and shook her hand at the door with a formality that would have been comical if it hadn't been so genuine. And Henry came last after everyone else had gone, when the light was going golden through the east windows she'd specified because she wanted morning light, and stood in the front room of the house she had built on her father's land and looked around at it with his hands in his pockets. She watched him look. "Well," she said. He turned to her. "It's right," he said simply. She had learned over 7 months that this was the highest thing Henry Sullivan said about anything. Not grand, not extravagant, just right. The word of a man who had thought carefully about what things should be and recognized when they had become it. She felt it move through her the way his words always did, quietly and thoroughly, and all the way down. "I have something to ask you," she said. He looked at her steadily, waiting. She had thought about how to say this for 3 weeks. She had practiced versions of it in the dark of her room at the Sullivan Ranch, and discarded all of them because they were either too formal or not formal enough, or they didn't sound like her. What she had landed on was simply the thing itself, plainly stated because she was Josephine Parker, and she had learned that plain was better than ornamented and true was better than careful. "I want you to come here," she said. "Not as a guest, not as a neighbor. I want you to come here as the person who comes here, who has a reason to come here that is specific and chosen and not obligation." She met his eyes. "I want you to court me, properly, with the intention of whatever comes after properly, if that's what this becomes." She breathed. "I'm asking because I don't want it to happen around the edges of everything else. I want it to be a decision, made out loud, by both of us." Henry looked at her. The stillness in his face was different from his regular stillness. This was the stillness of something very large being held very carefully. "You want me to court you," he said. "Yes." "Properly." "Yes." "Starting when?" She blinked. Then she understood that he was not being cautious or reluctant. He was asking because he intended to begin immediately and wanted to know whether she was ready. She almost laughed. The feeling rose in her chest, and she let it warm and real and unmanaged. "Starting now," she said. He crossed the room. He stopped in front of her close enough that she could see the specific gray of his eyes that she had been cataloging for months, and he held out his hand the way he had on the very first night, formally simply a hand extended across a space. She looked at it. She put her hand in his. "Henry Sullivan," he said, as if they were meeting for the first time. As if the fire and the courtroom and the forensic report and the negotiation and the winter and the spring were all gathered into this one moment and given a new name. "Calling on Miss Josephine Parker, with intentions." She looked up at him. "Josephine Parker," she said, "receiving." She held his gaze. "With equal intentions." His hand closed around hers, warm and steady and certain. She had stood in a burning house and whispered a prayer into smoke. She had crawled through broken glass in the dark. She had sat in courtrooms and signed documents and walked through a town that was deciding what to make of her and held her chin level the whole time. She had built a house with her own hands on her father's land and hung her mother's photograph on the wall where the morning light would find it. She had done every single piece of it herself, and now she was standing in the finished front room of her own house, with her hand in the hand of a man who had ridden toward a fire instead of away from it, and who had stood beside her through everything that came after. Not to carry her, not to fix her, but simply and consistently to be there. And she understood that being strong enough to stand alone and being wise enough to choose someone to stand with were not opposites. They were the same thing. The same hard-won, fire-tested, fully conscious thing. Outside her east windows, the evening light was doing something extraordinary with the sky over the Parker land. Her father's land, hers. Now in every way that mattered, and she did not need to look at it to feel it. She could feel it the way you feel something that belongs to you. She held Henry Sullivan's hand in the front room of her new house, and she felt rising in her chest completely and irrevocably and without any qualification whatsoever, the thing she had stopped believing in so long ago that she had almost forgotten its shape. Not just safety, not just stability, not just the solid good thing of having survived. Joy. Clean, uncomplicated, unqualified joy. The kind that does not come from the absence of pain, but from the presence of something real and chosen, and worth every difficult step that led to it. The fire had come for her. She had refused to let it win. And everything. The fire had tried to take her inheritance, her name, her sense of herself as someone worth saving. She had walked back into and reclaimed piece by piece with her own hands and her own voice and her own will, and she had come out the other side with more than she had started with, because among everything the fire had tried to destroy it, had also lit the road that brought her here. To this house. To this hand in hers. To this life that was at last entirely and completely and unmistakably her own. She had whispered her final prayer in the burning flames, and in every way that mattered, every single one, it had been answered.